Hi, everybody. Welcome to Boost CYC's webinar series. Today, Nene Kwasi Kafele is going to be our facilitator. But before we begin our session, there are a few quick housekeeping points that I'm going to go over. For participants listening in French, click on Floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. The French version of this PowerPoint and the PowerPoint from Nene's Part 1 webinar will be translated and sent out to everybody in a couple of weeks. There will be a question and answer period during the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar. To submit your question, please go to the toolbar on the right, click on messaging, and then participants, and type in your question. You can submit your questions at any time, but Nene will be going through them and answering them, as I said, the last 10 minutes or so of the webinar. If you are watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants that you have in your group by clicking on messaging and then participants. Thank you. And now I will turn it over to Nene.
Good day, everyone. I'm really happy to be speaking with you today and sharing with you some thoughts on anti-Black racism, anti-oppression from an organizational change perspective. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous presence and stewardship of these lands on which we are, and that these are largely unceded territories of many Indigenous nations across Canada. We also recognize the Indigenous community's ongoing fight and struggle against colonization, white supremacy, and racism. We stand in solidarity with our Indigenous sisters and brothers who are currently going through another wave of significant exposure of the impact of white supremacy and colonization through the ongoing discovery of the remains of children who were part of the residential schools across the country. So our support and solidarity goes out to our sisters and brothers in the community. We also recognize that this is an incredible moment in our history with the convergence of so many forces: Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Asian hate, homophobia. We've all seen a rise in incidents of discrimination, violence, and death against vulnerable populations from these backgrounds. It is a moment for leadership. It is a moment for allyship. It is a moment for courage, and it is a moment for action. So I would just like a moment of silence in honor of what I've just identified, please. Thank you. Today's webinar will speak to critical issues and considerations that should be a part of any change process when it comes to integrating anti-oppression and anti-racism considerations in your work with children and youth. As you partner, as you lead, as you plan, as you advocate, the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable amongst us include our Indigenous and African Canadian communities. across every indicator of vulnerability, we find that they consistently are the most vulnerable. Education, health, child welfare, income inequality, and abject poverty, mental health problems, addiction issues, homelessness, isolation, exclusion, disconnection. So it means that for these two populations in particular, and I'm not excluding others, but for these two populations in particular, the children and young people will be particularly exposed to a range of threats and challenges and issues that will make them incredibly vulnerable to a large degree. Now, having said that, we are certainly not ascribing any pathology to any community in identifying the realities for some in the community and the structural and systemic issues that bring young people from these vulnerable and other vulnerable communities into a relationship with you, whether it is a programming relationship, a clinical relationship, an advocacy relationship. So that is the basis for this webinar. It does not exclude other vulnerable populations, but we want to make sure that we are very clear about the stark realities that we're pressed up against. This moment also provides an opportunity for deep reflection on how we are able to summon our strength, our energies, our collective spirits in standing up, in aligning, in supporting each other, in community with each other, in solidarity with each other when members of our community are most vulnerable. It is when we summon our energies of love and kindness and courage and support to make sure we provide the kind of protection that is necessary, and we actually confront the forces of oppression in ways that are organized, strategic, and effective. So this is a moment for all of us to shine our best light in terms of community. And why are we focusing on anti-Black racism and anti-oppression at this time? Our agencies generally in the sector are still European-led and controlled spaces, and that speaks to a lack of representation and diversity at the highest levels in terms of critical decisions and planning. And it doesn't mean that you automatically become more effective if you have representation and diversity, but you certainly will bring a diversity of expertise and experiences, lived experiences, that will enrich your decision-making and build your credibility. And our child welfare system has been based primarily on Eurocentric underpinnings in terms of values, worldviews, and assumptions. And so issues, for example, of racial trauma, issues of developing practice frameworks that underscore the importance of culture and race and language and sexual orientation, those things are often an afterthought because they're not generally a part of the dominant ideological framing of how children and youth should be supported. And the biases present in mainstream youth-serving agencies and the sector as a whole reflect the same challenges of racism and oppression present against BIPOC and other marginalized groups in mainstream Canadian society. So individual agencies are typically a reflection of the disparities and inequities we see in the larger community. And BIPOC, for those who don't know, is an acronym that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Social and demographic imperatives demand urgent, socially responsible, and strategic anti-oppression change in agency practices. So we have this moment, as I have shared earlier, that requires a certain kind of leadership, a certain insightful, capable set of decisions around how to ensure that as a society we're being as responsive as possible. And there is tremendous interest and commitment to change right across the board, from people with goodwill, good conscience, commitment, and um, and the right kind of values to say it is time. It is time we do better. It is time we do better as a sector. It's time we do better as individual agencies, and it's time we do better as a society. So this is a moment for all of us. And the moment requires leadership. And so here I put together this design. It is not the best artwork, but hopefully it will do for now, which provides a full spectrum set of competencies that will position your agency to be as effective as possible. Centered on all of this is a focus on results, activities that are driven by data. Accountability is a priority. Safety, both for staff and for young people, should be prioritized. And your practices should be inclusive and transparent. And you should center anti-racism and anti-oppression in all the work. And then I have different streams: strategic thinking, social transformation, proactive community engagement, client service and programming excellence, performance excellence, transformative leadership, human financial resources, and capacity building. So I have selected some of these to work through with you. It won't be all of them, but certainly I'm hoping this is a stepping stone for your further individual work. Change management involves a range of things that ideally work together to make your change effective and appropriate and meaningful for all the stakeholders involved, the children and youth involved, community partners, your staff, of course, and your volunteers. And it involves you planning, having an anti-oppression plan that is clear and robust, and a process for ensuring that staff is on board in understanding the nature and scope of the planning and how it relates directly to their work and their responsibilities, and what kinds of impact the plan should show for you as an agency in the quality of services you deliver, the quality of relationships you engender, and the quality of connection your staff members have with each other, with the children and youth, and with the communities they serve. Executed well, it will result in improved performance, provide you flexibility in terms of options, and should have a grounding in your larger strategic planning process and operational framework in a way that's measurable and timely and impactful. So we're going to talk a little about what that looks like in reality. The first thing is the strategic thinking. Any leader in an agency that is committed to full spectrum change with respect to anti-Black racism and anti-oppression has to consider a range of things, a range of issues, a range of imperatives that will impact the way in which this work unfolds. Simply stepping into change without being measured and strategic is a recipe for failure. Thinking strategically, stepping back and looking at the big picture. What is happening in the context of the various communities, in the children and youth sector, in your agency and amongst your staff in terms of these issues? What are the things that are bubbling up? What are the opportunities? What are the emerging questions? What are the really critical challenges that need to be faced? What is the broad view going ahead, and what is the retrospective view looking back? And how do you understand and interpret the big picture in terms of what you need to do with respect to implications and options for change? How do you monitor and read the environment? Right now, the environment in Canada and many parts of the States and in Europe is one that for the moment appears to be more receptive and open to dialogue to reflection, to shifting the yardsticks, and to some measure of change, given some of the devastating developments we've had in the last year and a half in terms of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and homophobia in particular. The COVID-19 crisis has also exposed a lot of vulnerability in our structures and our social systems, where those who are most likely to be impacted have been significantly impacted, primarily based on income, race, and gender. And all of these contextual developments in the last while have led to more opportunities for planning, for revisiting, for changing, for attacking old problems in new and different ways, and for foregrounding concerns about children and youth in this environment. Shifts in the children and youth sector in terms of policy changes, in terms of implications for funding cuts and what it might mean for quality of services, opportunities for new resource development, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of thinking is important. Making difficult decisions and building the reputation of the agency in terms of connecting and building community relationships, providing impactful leadership in terms of programming and so on, speaking externally to the issues that are relevant to your agency's mandate and the constituency and the client base that you serve or that you seek to serve, and doing so proactively, not only reactively when something happens, but taking the long view. All of these really point to a commitment to thinking strategically and proactively around these issues. And of course, at the heart of everything is the care and programming you provide for children and youth. We can't talk about change management unless we look at what it is that should drive this change at the very heart of your work. Resilience, healing centered, trauma-informed perspective, especially because many of the young people you work with will have been exposed to traumatizing events and experiences. And so centering racial trauma is a task and a responsibility that needs to be taken seriously. Racial trauma is not very much in the vernacular, and more importantly, not very much in the practice of youth serving agencies. The trauma that's usually centered are sexual trauma and the trauma of war and violence and separation. Racial trauma should equally be prioritized. Understanding how that plays out for children and youth who are vulnerable goes a long way to impacting and informing the kinds of ways you organize your services and supports for them. Championing BIPOC children and youth rights, providing services that are consonant with an equity-focused, anti-racist, anti-oppressive clinical and program practice framework. So it is not simply the occasional advocacy statement or special project. It should be integrated into your overall programming or practice approach, an operational approach in terms of what you value and the lens you will use in terms of the work that you do. Shows compassion and respect for children and youth, BIPOC children and youth, ensures bias-free process for research, admissions, assessment, care, etc. So it's a full spectrum commitment to integrating anti-racism and anti-oppression considerations throughout your programming and clinical work. Standards of excellence, accreditation, external reviews, client satisfaction, sector developments, community consultations, etc., complaints process, etc. How do you make sure that these mechanisms are consistently helping you to be as effective, as responsive, as culturally safe, and as excellent as you can be in terms of the services you provide? And your training commitment across the board. What is it you're doing to consistently build your staff's capacity and skill levels so that they can deliver and work in ways that are effective with BIPOC communities? Internal collaboration, working across teams to ensure there's consistency, um, involving operational staff who are typically most racialized in the decision making. Usually, as we know, there's a sharp disparity between frontline and management in terms of diversity. And frontline staff are often undervalued in terms of how their expertise is utilized in the planning process and the operational process. They are frequently there. Drawing on research and programs to serve marginalized clients. What does the data say? What are the most effective practices based on evidence that we can pull up in doing the work? How do we make sure that we're current in how we apply approaches to advocacy that involve the community and that really centers children and youth issues? Collaborates to reduce tensions, racial microaggressions, racial toxicity across the organization to improve service provisions. Leadership sometimes has a problem in naming and stating and identifying racism, naming, stating, identifying homophobia, naming, stating, identifying religious bigotry, particularly Islamophobia. And those things can fester and impact not only the mood and the well-being of staff, but their ability to deliver services appropriately and consistently. If there is no safety or safety is compromised because there is silence, exclusion, denial, or avoidance, then that sets the table for you being subpar in terms of your service delivery and your advocacy work. Meaningful allocation of resources. So you take the long view that this work requires operational commitment over a number of years and strategic insertion and connectivity across all aspects of the agency's work. Oops, sorry. So, change management. You are a leader of change in your agency. This change is sometimes forced on us. It's sometimes presented as an option or an opportunity, or it is sometimes developed out of a conviction that is the right way to go and the right thing to do. And you're a leader for this change in an environment where there is change fatigue, Zoom fatigue, COVID-19 uncertainties and anxieties and stress, disconnectedness, because the relationships we have are largely based on virtual connection or real people connection, concerns about resource stability in the sector, uneven communication in many respects, and a significant trauma that's being faced by many staff, vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue, because they have to either personally deal with many of the things that are bubbling up in our society directly or indirectly, or deal with them through the work with children and youth and how they show up with anger, fear, concerns, trauma, etc., etc. It's not easy. And all of this is complicated by a sense of uncertainty about where things are going and how. In this environment, you need measured, calm, strong, consistent, clear, and empathetic leadership that provides reassurance and support, that is inviting and inclusive, not exclusive or indicting, that speaks the truth to the gaps and challenges and issues and problems, but also rises to the occasion in terms of opportunities for growth, solidarity, and building on what is good and positive. And that means you're a champion. It means you're creating a compelling vision, you're motivating and inspiring others, you have a sense of urgency for change, and you're committed to building a long term um, process. You initiate and you manage change. You develop measurable, integrated plans that address the various critical issues that centers anti-Black racism and anti-oppression. Your communication is consistent. You acknowledge and address underlying resistance, racial microaggressions, and racial toxicity. You communicate, communicate, communicate. You foster innovation and creativity. In other words, you invite criticism, you invite critical reflection, you provide a safe space for folks to plan and brainstorm and share and blue sky things so that they can come with ideas that can generate the kind of interest and engagement that will encourage positive change and growth and build excitement. You're flexible in the face of all the various challenges we've talked about. So your ability to switch gears, to quickly review and revise your approach based on extenuating circumstances, to look ahead and anticipate some of the changes that might be coming and be prepared to respond appropriately. To understand that this is hard work, that is long-term and difficult at times, and that there are barriers, real hard barriers that will be there, but that it takes the kind of leadership and perseverance under pressure to do this and to manage this change appropriately. So what happens typically in an organization that is confronted by all of these things that need to happen? Programming excellence, building staff morale, managing a planning process, finding money, working with communities in ways that you probably haven't worked before, learning new things about these communities that you don't know or haven't really confronted before, dealing with your own biases and blind spots and knowledge gaps, building on your strengths and the things that you do well in these areas. All of those things in convergence can be a challenge um, to leaders, some leaders who are used to the status quo and who are wedded to the safety of predictability and consistency and order in one direction. Now, this change, this anti-Black racism, anti-oppression change, is proposing a dismantling of some of that thinking, is proposing a revisiting of some of the ways in which work has been done in the past, is proposing a critical review of the relationship with different communities, and is proposing a critical assessment, self-assessment of the agency's gaps, issues, and challenges, as well as its strengths. All of these can pose a challenge to some. And so that plays out in the form of active or passive resistance often. Leadership that is unmotivated and not really strong or clear in this area. There's no shared investment in the agenda. So it might be that some leaders are committed and on board, but the entire leadership body isn't. That it is the goodwill, the energy, the zeal of some managers or leaders who are pulling and pushing and so on, while others are simply going along, as opposed to there being a strong, coordinated, shared investment in moving the agenda forward. The level of awareness about how these issues actually play out for vulnerable communities is simply not there. In this age, when we have ready access to all kinds of data, and when you work in a sector that functions on and is driven by data, There's no excuse. Ignorance is no excuse. There are a million ways you can come to build your awareness about the critical issues that impact BIPOC children and youth, and how the trajectories of their journey that might lead them to you and your services. So you have a responsibility to know. You have a responsibility to seek out information, ask questions, connect and engage with those who share, who have those lived experiences. Do your homework, be prepared. That is a task of leadership. Silence and avoidance is another resistance activity. The world is falling apart. The repercussions of the George Floyd situation is everywhere. You know, there are upsurges and public remonstrations and demonstrations. There is noise and activity all over social media, all over the regular media, television, newspapers, etc. Communities are in an uproar. Lots of folks are driven to action. And you come to work and you say nothing to your staff. You have no acknowledgement that these issues have any relevance to your work. And it is devastating for those who come from those backgrounds and those who do have that level of empathy and who see the connection and relevance to your work. For leaders to be silent, for leaders to avoid the discussion, for leaders to act as if this doesn't happen in Canada. This is an American problem, and therefore it's not relevant to us or our work. Active denial that structural racism, homophobia, and violence are key drivers of oppression. Yeah, but those are expressions we hear all the time. Or it is an occasional misstep or a bad apple or one or two people who are being jerks, but generally we're good. We're good to go. You point them to the data around the dropout and failure rates in school. You point them to the data about overrepresentation in child welfare. You point them to the data around incarceration levels, arrest rates, sentencing levels, etc. You point them to the data about grinding, persistent, incredible poverty, deprivation, and want in Canada, the rich. You point them to all that data, and then you ask yourselves, how are children and youth in this community faring, given this reality for many? And what does that mean for our work? And how can we avoid or deny that these are structural issues once you look at the overwhelming evidence that is all around us? Undue and implicit pressure on racialized staff to lead, pull, push. This is not really our problem. So we'll get the South Asian person or the one Black staff on the management team to actually speak on behalf of the entire community and tell us what to do. So we abdicate the responsibilities of leadership and we offload it to the people who we think should be the ones to speak on this and act on it. There's no integration into long-term planning and resourcing. This is a special project on the side. And we know what happens to special projects. They end and usually they die. Expectations of accountability and performance from leaders is weak or non-existent. That is also an example of structural resistance. Lack of representation of BIPOC staff at senior levels in the agency is consistently showing the level of commitment that is needed around change in a meaningful way. And in the children and youth sector, this is a significant problem. Microaggressions and toxicity go unaddressed. Staff complain, staff talk about how they're being treated, what is being said, performance issues, silencing, exclusion, micro invalidation, micro assaults, micro insults, workplace that feels uncomfortable with comments and so on, and leadership doesn't do anything. These are only some examples. I'm sure you can think of others that you might have seen either in your agency or in other spaces that speak to a lack of strong leadership and serve to undermine potentially the changes that you're trying to push in your agency. I urge you to think through these and other examples and find the ways in which you can address them appropriately so that they become diminished in terms of their level of impact. And here's some tips to support the change we're talking about. Identify allies and partners early in the process. Find senior champions with decision-making power and influence to represent, to support, to push the changes you are advocating for and identifying at the highest levels. Plan strategically to reduce fatigue or sense of being overwhelmed. The agenda, as we have mentioned earlier, can be complicated, and especially when there are competing priorities and urgent needs in a variety of areas, the sense of being overwhelmed is real. So your timing, your strategic positioning, your acknowledgement that these issues can be challenging, those will go a long way towards determining the success of your change process. Build a team. Having a committee or a working group that is truly connected, where there is clarity of roles, there is respect and support, there's competence and capacity and good communication, that makes for a good team. So whatever change process you're involved in around these issues, it is supported, it is energized, and it is activated by a team of dedicated, strong, and committed members of your staff. Use inclusive language approaches while holding folks accountable. So we try to be engaging and inclusive in the ways in which we describe things while we're being frank and clear about those things. So we want people to feel angry and charged up and committed to change, as opposed to simply sinking into guilt and shame and silence. Want to engage current compelling data, which I mentioned earlier. We start with low-hanging fruit, easy wins, things we can do that show that change can be done and progress can be made in sometimes fairly straightforward ways. It could be something as simple as establishing a strong working relationship with the Indigenous, African Canadian, South Asian, or LGBTQ organizations in your catchment area who work with children and youth, and talking about what that might mean in terms of collaboration, in terms of, maybe potentially shared programming, in terms of information sharing, etc., etc. Formalize commitments in policy and operational plans. Do you have an equity policy that formalizes this work? So if the executive director is no longer there, you have a formal way of driving this work. Is it in your operational plans? So it's prioritized in terms of budgeting, in terms of decision-making, etc., etc. It is not a standalone project. Inviting critical and safe conversations, talking about things in ways that are constructive and healthy and kind and honest and productive, so that staff members feel included and engaged and heard and respected. Acknowledge and celebrate progress. When things change for the better, communicate to staff so they will know and they can appreciate that this process is yielding good results and is having an impact that is positive. The most important part of what you do, of course, is the people. And as a leader, your ability to motivate and develop staff is a significant part of managing change in your agency. And you start by building trust, consistency between what you say and do, following through on your commitments, communicate in a transparent and timely manner, be discreet and respectful of confidences, demonstrates respect for the legitimate role of unions. In building your integrity with your team, you ensure that there's a measure of ethical behavior that they will see from you. So when you do have challenges and problems, they have that to fall back on because they know you have consistently shown up in a particular way that is trustworthy. Was an objective, address issues of psychological safety identified by African Canadian and other staff members around what is it they will need to feel safe and what are the issues that might be preventing that from happening, whether they are inadvertent, whether they are obvious, whether they are deliberate, whether they are subtle. We provide an opportunity and a space for folks to be open and frank to say, this is what happens when you do or say this, and this is how it makes me feel. And these are not abstract things for a therapy session. These are really important for you to align your staff's morale and frame of reference and emotional well-being to ensure that they're in a place to be as effective as possible with your work, with children and youth, and also with each other as members of your team. Bringing the right mix of disciplines together, people with diverse backgrounds from different program areas to enrich the kind of conversation and planning and decision making you have. Leveraging the diversity of individuals on the team. So you invite perspectives that are different and diverse. You make sure that your staff reflect the client population, the diverse client population. And you resolve conflicts early in ways that are effective. You're honest and forthright and empathetic and respectful. You respect confidentiality. You find the processes, it might be a satisfaction survey or quick review that folks can do confidentially so they could share how they're feeling, what the issues are, and you surface in ways that are tactful and appropriate, and you address them in a timely manner. Manages conflict and ambiguity. Engages people with different perspectives to identify solutions, identify workplace and program-related anti-Black racism and oppression in all forms. Working while Black is an expression that has come into common parlance in the last while around some of the examples of microaggressions, racial microaggressions that affect members of the African Canadian community in the workplace. Most of these microaggressions apply to females, apply to other racialized groups, apply to members who are LGBTQ plus. They apply to folks who typically don't fit the mainstream norm. And they serve to diminish, to exclude, to devalue, to disrespect people's identities and lived experiences. And that can be psychologically and spiritually wounding. Managing conflict means creating opportunities for dialogue to identify and explore areas of concern, listening to understand priorities and pressures, affecting ensuring that voices that are typically ignored, silenced, or avoided get heard and are engaged. Faces rather than avoid conflict, names and addresses, oppressive practices. Works consistently to build safer space for staff, users, clients. Having a statement about your commitment to building a safer space. And I say safer because no space is completely safe, but we should all be working on making all of our spaces safer. So invite staff to share what it is we should be saying about our commitment to building safer spaces and how do we make sure that is clearly understood by all Do we make posters? Do we have something on our website? How do we articulate this in ways that are appropriate? And most importantly, how do we live this out in our relationship with each other as colleagues and our relationship with children and youth? How do we actively promote safety in our spaces? Performance management. Your performance management commitment should include clear and specific indicators that show that staff are using their capacity to manage things like racism, sexism, and homophobia appropriately, that they're using performance to plan and to execute your programming priorities, your advocacy work in ways that center anti-oppression and address racism. That you ensure that there are clear goals and indicators for these. And equally as important is that staff get the resources, the training, and the capacity building supports they need to be able to execute appropriately. So all your managers should have anti-oppression, equity, anti-racism performance indicators, and that should cascade down to your staff members in terms of their individual performance plans. This shows a measure of seriousness, commitment, and accountability. And that's the last slide. I know, Pearl, you were going to invite some questions.
Yes, just to remind people, if you have a question for Nene, to go to the messages tab on the right, it's the second one down, and type your question into the participants area. Thank you, Nene. I find myself
Thank you.
Hanging on pretty much everything you say.
Thank you. And thanks for listening, everyone.
It sometimes, you know, you've done this before. It can take a couple of minutes while people
takes a little while. Yes.
Think and type.
You guys are still there, right?
Yeah, they are.
Okay. I think there's a question or comment there.
So, yeah.
Okay. You're welcome, Michael.
I think you give us so much to think about, Nene, that sometimes all those things can feel overwhelming. Yeah, because we think about how much we need to do in our agencies and our work with our families and okay.
Mm-hmm. So Mickey, thank you, Nene. I'm sharing this content with my senior leadership. Mm-hmm. So Mickey, one of the things I would suggest is maybe have a game plan before you share. Maybe you identify a couple of things that you think they would be intrigued by as specific action items. You identify colleagues at your level who would be supportive and you wrap that in a package of change for them so they're not overwhelmed by a bunch of different things that need to happen. You might start with a project idea or proposal, and then you connect it to a larger plan at a later time. Um, Typically, senior management will say, yes, we agree, this sounds good, this is really important, but we're very busy, or we have no money, or can we put it off until the next strategic planning cycle or the next budgeting exercise? So, yeah, be strategic and cagey about how you present to senior management. And before you present to them, also maybe identify those on the team who you think would be most receptive and supportive, and you brief them ahead of time. In other words, you lay the groundwork for positive interchange and hopefully positive decision. Do you support agencies in developing or training their team? Um, it depends. You know, if you have a trainer or a training department, and depending on the topic and depending on the skills of their trainers, I think you can do some of this internally. Um, some of it you want to bring a measure of impartiality and objectivity. External facilitators have no axe to grind and no agendas. Um, so that might provide a measure of reassurance as well. Just as a point of clarification, there is a difference between training and capacity building, as you probably know. Training occurs intermittently every now and then. Training builds awareness and provides information and inspiration. And training references competencies and skills. Capacity building is very specific, timely, and consistent, and it drives the development of specific skills for a staff person that will be integrated into their performance plan and be used as part of their performance measure for which they'll be held accountable. And so there's a slight difference between capacity building and training generally. And so I urge organizations to do both, to provide the awareness building and so on, but then to drive that further in saying, how do we build competencies for you specifically based on the training experiences you've had? What kinds of tools and resources do we need to develop? And what expectations should we have of you with respect to your performance? And how are we going to measure that? Mickey, thank you. I'm one of the few racialized workers at my company. I'm continually asked what we should be doing as an agency. I was planning to forward this material and put the ball in their court. I don't want to be the driver of the work. Completely understood, Mickey, and it's a really unfair position for racialized workers to always be caught up in. Being the ones to always raise the issue, being the ones to figure out what needs to be done, being the ones to drive it, and being the ones to remind and follow up and push and pull and push and pull. It is exhausting, it is incredibly disrespectful, and it is racist, to be quite frank. This is a shared responsibility. We get taxpayers' dollars to provide services to the community, not to particular parts of the community at the expense of other parts of the community. And so I would say find colleagues of other identities who share your conviction and who are aligned and supportive of you, and make sure you don't feel isolated or alone, and you have a strategy going forward. Don't just dump all of this on your senior management team without a plan. Sometimes when you leave the ball in their court, it just stays there. Well, any other thoughts or questions or comments? Yeah, I think we have one more here. Thanks for everything, Nene. What's an effective strategy to address a microaggression? It depends on what it is, but one of the things I tell people is to ask out of curiosity why the person would say what they said. So it's inviting a conversation and also triggering them to do some self-reflection. And a conversation, because many microaggressions are unwitting, a conversation about the impact, I think, is important in building awareness. And you start with the individual first, with whom you've had the interaction, so folks don't feel shamed or embarrassed. And then you might have a conversation with your team about microaggressions generally, defining it. There are a couple of wonderful videos I have. I could post it. I think I could quickly post it. Pearl, how could I do that?
You know what? Because I'm going to be sending out the PowerPoints. If you send them to me, then they'll go out to our whole.
Everyone.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. The impact of microaggressions is to diminish people's self-esteem, to make them feel different and devalued and dehumanized. It is to question their legitimacy by sometimes expressions that appear to be very innocuous, even kind, but they serve to reinforce a particular stereotype or assumption or status quo. Something as benign as where you're from, which, I just want to know where you're from. You obviously are not from here because you look different, even though you might be fifth or sixth generation American or Canadian, but you happen to not be white. Where you're from serves to remind you of the otherness of your reality, regardless of how long you've been here, that you don't belong here. You're not one of us. You're not really one of us. You're not really a full Canadian or American because I assume you came from somewhere else. Or you speak so well, you're so articulate and so bright, so well spoken. The implication being that people like you are generally not bright or well spoken. And I have to express my pleasant surprise at how well you speak, when we don't normally say that of mainstream folks. We just assume that people can speak well and that they're bright people, right? Yeah, those are microaggressions that might appear to be pleasant and even complimentary on the face of it, but that can be devastating. And the impact, the cumulative impact, when you hear this over and over and over again, that has a psychological impact on the person to whom it's directed. And there are lots of research around the level of depression and so on that occurs from persistent microaggressions, especially in the workplace. Anyway, I think time is up. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you, Nene. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.